Picture this: a cold, damp cell in Berkeley Castle, the year 1327. The air is thick with fear and betrayal. Inside, a king, once powerful, now broken, waits in darkness. Edward II, ruler of England, has been overthrown by his own wife and her lover, forced to abdicate the throne, his fate unknown, his end shrouded in whispers, rumors, and horror. The official story claims he died naturally, but the truth far more sinister, because Edward II didn't just die, he was murdered, and the how, the why, and the who behind it remain one of medieval history's most chilling unsolved mysteries. This isn't just a tale of royal downfall, it's a story soaked in blood, political scheming, and a cover-up that spanned centuries. Imagine the stakes: a kingdom in chaos, a queen who betrayed her husband, and a death so brutal it was hidden behind layers of lies. Some say Edward was suffocated. Others claim his killers used a red-hot poker in a method too gruesome to describe. But here's the thing: no one knows for sure. Because the real story of Edward II's murder is a puzzle with missing pieces, a dark riddle wrapped in the shadows of history, and that's exactly what we're unraveling today. Because this isn't just about a king's death, it's about power, revenge, and the lengths people will go to silence the truth. Was it his wife, Queen Isabella, desperate to secure the throne for her son? Or her lover, Roger Mortimer, hungry for control? Or was there something even darker at play? Stick around, because we're diving deep into the evidence, the theories, and the shocking twists that keep this medieval mystery alive. By the end, you'll see why Edward II's murder isn't just history, it's a thriller waiting to be solved. To understand why Edward II met such a violent end, we have to look at the chaos that defined his reign from the very beginning. He wasn't just an unlucky king, he was a disastrous one. Crowned in 1307, Edward inherited a throne already strained by his father's wars and heavy taxes. But instead of uniting his kingdom, he poured gasoline on the flames. His fatal flaw, favoritism. Edward's obsession with Piers Gaveston, a charming but arrogant knight, alienated nearly every powerful noble in England. Gaveston wasn't just a close friend, he was showered with land, titles, and influence far beyond what his low birth should have allowed. The barons seethed as Gaveston mocked them, even giving them humiliating nicknames like the Black Dog of Artois. Worse, Edward seemed to care more about Gaveston's approval than running his kingdom. When the nobles finally had enough and exiled Gaveston, Edward just brought him back twice. This wasn't just petty drama, it was a full-blown political crisis. The nobility, already frustrated by Edward's weak leadership, saw a king who valued personal loyalty over the good of England. Taxes were mismanaged, military campaigns failed spectacularly, like the disastrous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Edward's army was crushed by the Scots. His reign became a slow-motion car crash of bad decisions, and then there was Queen Isabella, Edward's wife. Once a devoted partner, she grew increasingly isolated as Gaveston, and later, another favorite, Hugh Despenser, dominated Edward's attention. The marriage became a hollow shell, pushing Isabella toward the arms of Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron with his own ambitions. By the time Edward's reign unraveled, even his own family had turned against him. So when we ask why Edward was murdered, the answer starts here. His reign wasn't just troubled, it was a masterclass in how to lose a kingdom. The nobles despised him. His wife betrayed him, and by the time his enemies closed in, hardly anyone was left to defend him. The stage was set for one of history's most shocking royal downfalls. Isabella of France was no ordinary queen. Remembered as the she-wolf of France, she started her story as a political pawn married to Edward II at just 12 years old to strengthen ties between England and her native France. At first, she played the dutiful wife, even tolerating his infamous favoritism toward Piers Gaveston. but as Edward's reign spiraled into chaos, so did their marriage. The breaking point came with Hugh Despencer the Younger, Edward's new favorite, whose greed and influence eclipsed even Gaveston's. Despencer didn't just steal the king's attention, he stole Isabella's lands, her income, and her dignity. Then came the final insult. In 1324, Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission, and she never came back. Instead, she found an ally in Roger Mortimer, a disgraced baron who had escaped the Tower of London and fled to Paris. Together, they became the ultimate power couple. Mortimer was ruthless, ambitious, and ready to overthrow Edward. Isabella, she was done playing the victim. The question historians still debate is whether her actions were driven by personal vengeance or cold political calculus. Some paint her as a betrayed wife who snapped, orchestrating her husband's murder to punish him for years of humiliation. Others argue she was a strategic genius, using Edward's failures to secure the throne for her son, the future Edward III. After all, a deposed king was dangerous, but a dead king. That was permanent. The rumors only grew darker after Edward's death. Whispers claimed Isabella gave the order herself, or at least knew what Mortimer had planned. But here's what's chilling. If she was involved, she got away with it. For years, she and Mortimer ruled as de facto monarchs until her own son turned against them. Even then, while Mortimer swung from the gallows, Isabella retired to a comfortable exile. The she-wolf didn't just survive, she outplayed everyone. So was she a heartbroken woman pushed to the edge, or a Machiavellian schemer who used her husband's downfall to her advantage? The truth might be both, because in medieval politics, love and power were never simple, and Isabella understood that better than anyone. Isabella and Mortimer didn't just plan a rebellion. They executed a full-scale invasion with the precision of a military campaign. In September 1326, Isabella landed on the Suffolk coast with a small but ruthless army of mercenaries, exiles, and disgruntled English nobles. This wasn't just a force of arms, it was a propaganda masterstroke. Isabella positioned herself not as a traitor, but as a savior, the wronged queen returning to free England from the tyranny of Hugh Despencer and her weak-willed husband. The people, exhausted by Edward's mismanagement, flocked to her side. Edward's response: panic. He fled west, dragging Despencer with him as Isabella's forces advanced unchecked. London erupted in chaos. Mobs tore apart anyone loyal to the king, and the city quickly surrendered to Isabella. By November, Edward was cornered in Wales, abandoned by nearly everyone except a handful of desperate followers. Even his own army melted away. When he was finally captured near Neath Abbey, the humiliation was absolute. The king had become a prisoner in his own kingdom. With Edward in chains, the real political theater began. Isabella and Mortimer needed his abdication to legitimize their rule, but forcing a king to renounce his crown wasn't simple. It had to look voluntary. Under heavy guard, Edward was brought to Kenilworth Castle, where Parliament confronted him with an ultimatum: step down or face even harsher consequences. Broken and defeated, he agreed. On January 24, 1327, Edward II became the first English king to formally abdicate. His 14-year-old son was crowned Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer pulling the strings behind the throne. But here's the chilling part: deposing Edward solved nothing. A living ex-king was a lightning rod for rebellion. Already, plots were forming to restore him. Isabella and Mortimer couldn't risk it. Edward had to disappear. And that's when the whispers started, because within months the former king was dead under circumstances so suspicious, even medieval chroniclers struggled to believe the official story. The invasion didn't just topple a king, it set the stage for a murder disguised as an accident, a crime so carefully orchestrated that the truth might never be fully known. Berkeley Castle wasn't just a prison, it was a tomb of stone and silence. Built to withstand sieges, its thick walls now served a different purpose: to erase a king from the world. When Edward II arrived here in April 1327, his fate was already sealed. Stripped of his crown, his freedom, even his identity, he was reduced to a nameless prisoner in the very place where his ancestors had once held court. The conditions were as brutal as the politics that put him there. His cell, likely in the castle's bowels, was damp and frigid, a far cry from the lavish palaces he'd known. Some accounts claim he was moved frequently to prevent rescue attempts, dragged between Berkeley and other strongholds like a ghost in chains. The few servants allowed near him were handpicked by Mortimer's men, their loyalty bought or threatened. Even the castle's location, perched on a hill overlooking the River Severn, was a cruel irony. Water meant trade, escape, life, but for Edward it only emphasized how cut off he was. Then there's the castle's darkest legend, the King's Gallery, a room where Edward supposedly met his end. Visitors today claim it's haunted by echoes of his final screams. Whether true or not, the story speaks to the terror of his imprisonment. No witnesses, no allies, just the slow crush of isolation. But here's what chills historians most, the precision of his captors. Edward wasn't just locked away, he was disappeared. Official records from this period are suspiciously sparse, as if someone was already scrubbing the truth. Letters mentioning his health suddenly stop. Guard rotations are left unrecorded. Even the castle staff logs from that spring vanish like smoke. This wasn't negligence. It was a cover-up in real time, because in those final weeks, something unspeakable was being planned behind Berkeley's walls. And the silence surrounding Edward's captivity wasn't just confinement, it was the prelude to murder. The official announcement came on September 21, 1327. Edward II had died peacefully at Berkeley Castle. According to the carefully crafted statement released by his captors, the former king succumbed to natural causes after a brief illness. The chronicles of the time repeated this version dutifully, some even expressing solemn sympathy for the tragic but inevitable passing of a deposed monarch. On the surface, it all seemed plausible enough. Edward had endured months of harsh imprisonment, the stress of losing his crown, and the humiliation of public defeat. A sudden illness wouldn't have raised eyebrows in an era when even minor infections could turn fatal. But scratch that surface and the story unravels. First, there's the timing. Edward's death came just months after a foiled plot to free him from captivity, a plot that would have restored him to power and toppled Isabella and Mortimer's fragile regime. Coincidence? Unlikely. Then there's the complete absence of any contemporary medical details. No symptoms, no treatments, not even the name of a physician who attended him. For a king, even a disgraced one, this silence is deafening. Medieval chroniclers loved recording gruesome ailments, yet Edward's supposed illness gets vaguer with each retelling. The most damning clue, though, lies in the reaction of those who knew the truth. When Edward's son, the young King Edward III, later had Mortimer executed for treason, the charges conspicuously avoided mentioning the former king's death. It was an open secret no one dared voice. Even the funeral raised suspicions. Edward's body was displayed in an open coffin, highly unusual for a royal burial, as if to prove he hadn't been mutilated. Yet witnesses noted the face was heavily made up, hiding. Why did so many accept the natural causes story? Because challenging it was suicide. Isabella and Mortimer controlled the narrative, the messengers, and the punishment for dissent. In a world where power dictated truth, questioning the official line meant risking your life. But beneath that thin veneer of legitimacy, the whispers persisted. Because when a king dies in captivity at the peak of his enemy's fear, natural causes is never just natural causes. Whispers spread like wildfire through the taverns and halls of England within weeks of Edward's death because no one who knew the man believed he'd simply dropped dead. The first cracks in the official story appeared in the chronicles of monks like Adam of Muirmouth, who wrote with careful ambiguity that Edward ended his life at Berkeley Castle. No mention of illness, no pious farewells, just a loaded phrase that hinted at something darker. Even the usually loyal Lanercost Chronicle noted the king's death was sudden and suspicious, a rare breach of medieval decorum when discussing royalty. Then came the nobles who'd been too afraid to speak publicly. Private letters from the period, uncovered centuries later, reveal a chilling consensus among Edward's former enemies. This was no accident. One baron's correspondence referred to the ex-king's death as necessary business, while another cryptically warned his allies not to ask questions unless you wished to join him. These weren't grieving subjects, they were men who understood the rules of power. A deposed king was a liability, a dead king that was just politics. But the most damning account came from a source no one expected, Geoffrey Le Baker, a chronicler writing decades later. His description of Edward's murder is so graphic, it reads like a horror story. According to Baker, assassins crept into the castle at night, pinned the king down, and this is the part that made historians wince, used a red-hot poker to kill him, in a manner leaving no outward mark. The detail wasn't just gruesome, it was plausible. A burned corpse could be dressed for viewing without obvious wounds, explaining the heavy makeup on Edward's face during his public funeral. Why did these whispers persist despite Isabella and Mortimer's efforts to silence them? Because medieval England thrived on gossip, especially when it involved the powerful. Peasants swapping tales in alehouses, monks scribbling between the lines of official histories, they all knew the truth stank. And when Edward III eventually turned on Mortimer, executing him for treason without ever charging him with patricide, it only deepened the suspicion. The unspoken hung heavier than any verdict. Some crimes were too dangerous to acknowledge, even for a king seeking justice. The official story might have been written in ink, but the real one was etched in whispers. The red-hot poker story is the stuff of medieval nightmares, an image so visceral it seared into popular imagination. According to the most infamous version of Edward II's death, his killers didn't just murder him. They tortured him using a white-hot metal rod in a method designed to leave no visible wounds. It's a detail so grotesque it feels invented. But where did this tale come from, and could there be any truth to it? The earliest mention of the poker appears in Geoffrey Le Baker's chronicle, written nearly 30 years after Edward's death. Baker describes a scene straight out of a horror story. Assassins bursting into Edward's cell, suffocating him under a mattress, then searing his insides with a plumber's iron through a horn funnel. The specificity is chilling, but here's the catch: Baker wasn't an eyewitness. He was piecing together rumors decades later, possibly drawing on whispers from disgraced members of Mortimer's circle. Even worse for the story's credibility, no contemporary source mentions it, not one. So why did it stick? Because it served a purpose. By the mid-14th century, Edward's son had cemented his rule, and the young king had every reason to let the darkest rumors about his father's killers flourish. A gruesome murder narrative painted Isabella and Mortimer as monsters, justifying their downfall. The poker story wasn't just salacious gossip, it was political weaponry, a way to blacken reputations without direct accusation. But let's play devil's advocate. Could there be a kernel of truth beneath the layers of embellishment? Some historians point to the oddities of Edward's funeral, the heavy makeup, the refusal to let mourners inspect the body closely. A burn severe enough to require covering up might explain the secrecy. Others argue the method itself, while brutal, was plausible for the era. Medieval assassins favored techniques that left corpses presentable, especially when the victim was royalty. Smothering combined with internal burns, it's not impossible, just unprovable. What's most telling, though, is how the story evolved. Later chroniclers, like the dramatic Thomas de la Mure, amped up the horror, adding lurid details about Edward's screams echoing through Berkeley Castle. By the time Shakespeare immortalized the poker in Edward Roman II, it had transcended history, becoming legend. That's the thing about propaganda: the wilder the tale, the harder it is to erase. Whether fact or fiction, the red-hot poker isn't just a detail of Edward's death. It's a symbol of how history remembers tyrants, victims, and the messy truth that gets lost in between. The power of a whispered lie in the Middle Ages could topple kings, and Edward II's downfall was as much about perception as it was about swords or sieges. Long before his enemies laid hands on him, they'd already begun erasing his legitimacy through something far more insidious: propaganda. Imagine a world without printing presses or social media, where rumors spread like plagues in market squares and court corridors. Edward's opponents mastered this dark art, painting him not just as a bad ruler, but as a monster unfit to wear the crown. Take the relentless emphasis on his unnatural relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. Chroniclers loyal to Isabella and Mortimer didn't merely accuse Edward of favoritism, they spun lurid tales of debauchery, hinting at transgressions that would have horrified medieval moralists. One anonymous pamphlet circulated in 1326 described Edward's court as a den of shameful intimacies, while churchmen suddenly recalled his alleged disinterest in marital duties with Isabella. Never mind that these same critics had ignored such rumors for years. Now they were weapons, but the smear campaign went deeper. Stories circulated of Edward abandoning battles out of cowardice, even though his earlier military failures stemmed from poor strategy, not lack of courage. Petitions to Parliament accused him of letting Scotland slip away through negligence, ignoring the complex realities of border warfare. The goal was clear: reframe Edward's reign as a moral failure, not just political missteps. If the people believed their king was weak, corrupt, or sinful by divine standards, removing him became not treason but justice. And here's the genius of medieval propaganda: its fingerprints were impossible to trace. The chronicles repeating these accusations were often written years later, their sources conveniently anonymous. Isabella's allies didn't need to prove anything, they just needed enough murmurs to justify their coup. By the time Edward was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, his reputation had been hollowed out. A king stripped of his dignity is easier to depose, easier to kill. Yet the darkest irony, some of these smears outlived Edward by centuries. The red-hot poker tale, whether true or not, served the same purpose. It turned his murder into a grotesque spectacle that distracted from the cold, calculated politics behind it. Because in the end, propaganda wasn't just about destroying a man, it was about rewriting history so the victors could sleep soundly. And few victims were carved into legend as ruthlessly as Edward II. While the red-hot poker steals the spotlight, it's far from the only theory about how Edward met his end. Another persistent whisper claims he was smothered, a method just as deadly but far less theatrical. Imagine the scene: a pillow pressed over the face in the dead of night, muffled struggles, then silence. No blood, no visible wounds, just a man erased without a trace. It's a theory that aligns eerily well with the lack of marks on Edward's body during his public viewing. Medieval execution practices lend some credence to this version. Silent, untraceable killings weren't uncommon for high-status prisoners. Take the case of Richard II, another deposed English king who likely died by starvation or suffocation in captivity a century later. The goal was always the same: eliminate the threat while maintaining deniability. For Edward's killers, suffocation would have been a pragmatic choice: quick, quiet, and leaving no evidence to scandalize the public funeral. But strangulation lurks in the margins of the historical record too. Some chroniclers mention marks on Edward's neck, hastily covered with clothing or makeup. If true, it suggests a more hands-on approach, perhaps a garrote or even bare hands. Strangulation carried its own symbolic weight in medieval Europe, a death reserved for traitors and common criminals, a final humiliation for a fallen king. Here's where forensic history throws a wrench in the works. While suffocation leaves few traces on bones, strangulation often fractures the hyoid bone in the throat. Problem is, Edward's tomb was opened centuries later, and no reliable examination of his remains was ever recorded. Without that evidence, we're left with whispers and educated guesses. What makes these theories compelling isn't just their plausibility, it's what they reveal about the mindset of Edward's killers. A poker was brutal theater, suffocation was cold efficiency. Either way, the message was clear: this wasn't just a murder, it was a calculated erasure, and in the shadows of Berkeley Castle, the method mattered less than the certainty that Edward would never speak again. Here's where the mystery takes a truly bizarre turn, because what if Edward II didn't die in Berkeley Castle at all? Centuries after his supposed murder, a series of cryptic letters surfaced, allegedly written by Edward himself, claiming he'd escaped captivity and lived in exile for years. One, dated 1329, 2 years after his official death, was sent to his son, Edward III, begging for help. Another, penned to a trusted ally, detailed a daring prison break aided by sympathetic guards. At first glance, these documents seem like obvious forgeries, but dig deeper and the waters grow murkier. The letters first gained attention in the 19th century when historians uncovered them in obscure European archives. Their phrasing matched Edward's known writing style, down to the peculiar Latin abbreviations he favored. Even more intriguing, they referenced private conversations only the real Edward would have known, like a childhood promise between father and son about a favorite hunting dog. Medieval forgers were skilled, but this level of intimate detail strains credibility. Skeptics argue these were clever fabrications, possibly created during Edward III's reign to legitimize his rule by suggesting his father had willingly abdicated. After all, a living Edward in exile was less threatening than a martyred king murdered under Mortimer's orders. Others proposed the letters were part of a later political stunt, maybe even planted by Tudor propagandists to destabilize rival noble claims. Yet some historians point to a chilling possibility. What if Isabella and Mortimer wanted the world to think Edward was dead while secretly keeping him alive elsewhere? It wouldn't be the first time a medieval prisoner was hidden in plain sight. Rumors swirled for years about a hooded man seen at European monasteries, his identity whispered but never confirmed. The truth might lie in the gaps. Berkeley Castle's records from that era are riddled with oddities: payments to unnamed guards, sudden renovations to the dungeon walls, even a hastily dug tunnel later bricked up. Were these signs of a botched escape or staged evidence to sell the murder story? Without the originals of those letters, we're left with echoes. But one thing's certain: in the shadow game of medieval power, even a king's death could be an illusion. The most tantalizing clue in Edward II's mystery doesn't come from an English chronicle or a royal decree. It's a single letter written in shaky Latin, discovered centuries later in the archives of a small Italian church. Known as the Fieschi Letter, this fragile document, dated to the 1340s, claims Edward didn't die in Berkeley Castle at all. Instead, it tells an astonishing story. The deposed king escaped his captors, fled across Europe, and lived out his final years as a wandering hermit. The letter's author, a papal notary named Fieschi, insisted Edward himself had confessed the tale to him during a secret meeting in northern Italy. According to Fieschi, Edward detailed a daring prison break. Corrupt guards helped him slip away, a corpse was left in his cell to fake his death, and he then crossed the channel disguised as a pilgrim. The letter even names remote monasteries where Edward supposedly took refuge, including one in the shadow of the Alps where he allegedly died peacefully years later. So why would anyone believe such an outlandish story? For starters, Fieschi wasn't some random fraudster. He came from a powerful Genoese family with deep ties to the Vatican, making him an unlikely candidate to risk his reputation on a hoax. The letter's intricate details also align with known historical facts. The named monasteries did exist, the escape route matches actual pilgrim paths, and the timeline fits gaps in Edward's known movements. Even more compelling, Fieschi had no obvious motive to lie. This wasn't propaganda for a rival faction, just a quiet account buried in church records. But here's where skepticism creeps in. No other contemporary source corroborates the letter's claims. Edward III, who spent years avenging his father's murder, never mentioned a possible survival. And the logistics of the escape strain belief. How could a deposed king, one of the most recognizable men in Europe, evade capture for years? Yet some historians argue the letter's very obscurity might prove its authenticity. If Edward had truly escaped, revealing it would have destabilized England. Better to let the world think him dead, and the letter's casual references to obscure locations like a tiny chapel in Cologne suggest first-hand knowledge, not invention. The Fieschi Letter forces us to confront an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the most famous murder in medieval history never happened at all. Or perhaps it's an elaborate cover-up, a last twist in a story already drowning in deception. Either way, the letter remains a ghost at history's feast, a whisper that the past might be far stranger than we dare to believe. Imagine a deposed king stripped of his crown, his name erased from history, yet still drawing breath in the quiet hills of northern Italy. That's the audacious claim at the heart of the Fieschi Letter, a document that turns Edward II's story from tragedy into something closer to a medieval spy thriller. According to its account, Edward didn't die screaming in Berkeley Castle. Instead, he slipped through his captor's fingers, crossing Europe in disguise to live out his days in obscurity. But how much of this tale holds up to scrutiny? Let's start with the journey itself. The letter describes Edward fleeing England by boat, likely posing as a pilgrim, a brilliant cover, since pilgrims wore simple robes and traveled with little scrutiny. From there, he supposedly wound through France, stopping at remote abbeys where sympathetic monks offered shelter. These weren't random stops. The letter names specific sites like the Abbey of Corbie, which had historic ties to English royalty. Even more intriguing, the route mirrors known escape paths used by political fugitives of the era. For a man who'd spent years at war with France, Edward would have known these roads well. Then there's the supposed final chapter of his life, a hermitage near Milan where the letter claims Edward confessed his true identity to a priest before dying peacefully. This wasn't just any priest. Manuel Fieschi came from a family deeply embedded in papal politics, the kind of connections that could quietly protect a fallen king. The detail feels almost too perfect, yet Italy in the 14th century was a patchwork of independent states where a disguised noble could vanish easily. No centralized bureaucracy, no extradition treaties, just a labyrinth of local lords who might ask few questions for the right price. But here's where skeptics pounce. If Edward escaped, why didn't he seek help from allies? His half-brother Edmund of Woodstock had contacts across Europe. Then there's the logistics. Kings weren't just faces in a crowd. Edward had battled the French for years. His likeness would have been known to spies and border guards. And what of the body displayed at his funeral? Proponents of the survival theory argue a substitute could have been used, pointing to the heavy makeup and restricted viewing. Yet no contemporary source mentions a missing corpse or suspicious gaps in the burial records. Perhaps the most compelling counterargument lies in Edward III's actions. When he overthrew Mortimer, he never hinted his father might still be alive. Instead, he publicly mourned him, even commissioning an elaborate tomb. Would a son truly abandon a living father to preserve political stability? Or was the truth buried because it threatened the very legitimacy of his reign? The Fieschi Letter forces us to wrestle with an unsettling possibility. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the shadows they couldn't silence. Whether fact or fabrication, the letter endures as a testament to the most subversive idea of all, that in the Middle Ages, even a king's death could be a carefully staged illusion. Edward's funeral should have been a somber, straightforward affair, a final act of respect for a fallen king, however disgraced. Instead, it became another layer in the mystery. The ceremony at Gloucester Abbey in December 1327 was steeped in irregularities that raised eyebrows even in an era accustomed to royal intrigue. First, there was the casket itself. While medieval monarchs were typically embalmed and displayed for public mourning, Edward's body was kept conspicuously sealed. Only a handful of select attendees were permitted fleeting glimpses, and even then, witnesses noted something unsettling. The king's face was thickly coated in makeup, his features strangely rigid. This wasn't just protocol, it was a performance. Then there's the matter of timing. Royal funerals were usually grand, drawn-out affairs, allowing nobles and commoners alike to pay respects. Edward's burial, by contrast, felt rushed. The gap between his reported death and interment was unusually short, leaving little time for the customary processions or pilgrimages. Even more telling, the absence of his widow, Queen Isabella, who remained conspicuously absent from the rites. For a woman who'd once been his devoted wife, her no-show spoke volumes. Was it guilt, fear of public backlash, or simply proof that she'd already moved on? Historians are split on what these anomalies mean. Some argue the secrecy was standard for deposed kings. After all, Edward's father, Edward I, had delayed the burial of the rebel William Wallace for months to avoid creating a martyr. Others point to the precedent of King John, whose hurried funeral in 1216 was likely meant to downplay his unpopular reign. But here's where Edward's case stands apart: the sheer volume of whispers surrounding his death. When a monarch perishes under suspicious circumstances, a closed casket isn't just discretion, it's a red flag. The most damning detail, though, lies in what came after. Edward's tomb, commissioned by his son years later, became a site of pilgrimage with miracles attributed to the dead king's intercession. This was no accident. By allowing, even encouraging this reverence, Edward III subtly rebuked the official narrative. A martyr doesn't need an open casket. His legacy speaks through the cracks in the story they tried to bury. Roger Mortimer didn't just want power, he needed it to survive. By the time Edward II was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, Mortimer had already gambled everything. His rise from disgraced exile to de facto ruler of England was a high-wire act with no safety net. And Edward, even in chains, remained the one loose thread that could unravel it all. Mortimer's motives were as personal as they were political. After escaping the Tower of London in 1323, an audacious feat involving drugged guards and a rope ladder, he'd spent years plotting his return from France. But this wasn't just about vengeance. Edward's disastrous reign had left England fractured, and Mortimer saw himself as the strong hand the kingdom needed. The problem, strength alone wasn't enough. Legitimacy mattered, and Mortimer had none. As a baron, he couldn't claim the throne directly. His solution: rule through Isabella and her son, the young Edward III. Yet a living ex-king was a loaded gun pointed at Mortimer's head. Edward still had supporters, and rebellions were already brewing. In 1327, just months before Edward's death, a plot to storm Berkeley Castle was narrowly foiled. The message was clear: as long as Edward drew breath, he was a magnet for dissent. For Mortimer, killing him wasn't just practical, it was existential. But here's where the waters muddle. Did Mortimer act alone, or was Isabella complicit? Chroniclers paint conflicting pictures. Some depict Mortimer as the ruthless architect, pressuring a reluctant Isabella into compliance. Others suggest she was an eager partner, whispering orders while maintaining plausible deniability. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Isabella had reason to fear Edward's restoration. It would mean her own downfall, possibly even charges of treason. Yet ordering her husband's murder crossed a line even medieval queens hesitated to cross. Mortimer's later actions hint at his desperation. As rumors of Edward's murder spread, he tightened his grip, executing rivals and silencing critics. But the damage was done. When Edward III finally turned on him in 1330, Mortimer's fate was sealed. Strikingly, the charges at his trial never mentioned regicide, perhaps because accusing him would have forced the young king to confront his mother's role. In the end, Mortimer's motive was survival in a game where losing meant death, but his greatest miscalculation, underestimating the ghost of the man he'd tried to erase. Because Edward's shadow, whether buried at Gloucester or wandering Europe, proved far harder to kill than the king himself, Isabella's triumph over Edward II should have been the beginning of her glory. Instead, it marked the start of her slow unraveling. For 3 years after the king's death, she and Roger Mortimer ruled England as the ultimate power couple, governing through her young son, Edward III. They held lavish tournaments, distributed lands to loyal supporters, and even negotiated a peace treaty with Scotland. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. Mortimer's arrogance grew unchecked. He flaunted his power with new titles and castles, even arranging the execution of Edward II's half-brother, Edmund of Woodstock, on flimsy treason charges. Meanwhile, Isabella, once the people's beloved she-wolf, watched her popularity sour. The queen who had promised to restore order now stood by as Mortimer's greed alienated the nobility and drained the treasury. Then came the moment that changed everything. In October 1330, a 17-year-old Edward III staged a midnight coup at Nottingham Castle, bursting into his mother's chambers to personally arrest Mortimer. The scene was fraught with drama. Isabella reportedly screamed, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," but Edward, now old enough to grasp the truth of his father's fate, showed no mercy. Within weeks, Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn, his corpse left swinging for 2 days as a warning. Isabella, spared execution but stripped of power, was sent into comfortable exile at Castle Rising in Norfolk. The question historians still debate is whether Isabella's downfall was driven by guilt. Did she finally grasp the horror of what she'd set in motion? Chroniclers note her increasingly erratic behavior in those final years with Mortimer: lavish spending sprees, sudden religious fervor, even rumors of self-imposed fasting. Some speculate these were signs of a conscience in turmoil. Others argue it was purely political. She'd bet on the wrong ally and lost. But consider this: when Mortimer faced the gallows, the charges against him conspicuously avoided mentioning Edward II's murder. Was that Edward III's way of shielding his mother from the full weight of their shared crime? Isabella's later years offer tantalizing clues. In exile, she surrounded herself with Franciscan friars known for their emphasis on penance. She donated generously to churches, including Gloucester Abbey, where Edward was buried. Most telling, she never publicly defended Mortimer or contested her son's version of events. The woman who once masterminded a coup now accepted her silence as the price of survival. Whether fueled by remorse or pragmatism, Isabella's story ends with a haunting symmetry. The queen who helped destroy a king spent her final decades as a shadow of herself, gazing from Castle Rising's towers at a world that had moved on. Power, it seemed, was as fragile as the lies that built it. And in the quiet of her confinement, she may have learned too late that some victories come with chains heavier than any dungeon. Edward III's silence on his father's murder isn't just a historical footnote, it's a roar in the form of omission. Here was a king who spent his reign avenging slights, crushing rebellions, and expanding English power. Yet when it came to the darkest secret of his family, he never uttered a word against his mother or Roger Mortimer. The question isn't just why he stayed quiet, it's what that silence reveals about the brutal calculus of medieval power. Start with the most pragmatic explanation: survival. When Edward III seized control in 1330, he was just 17, ruling a kingdom still teetering from his parents' civil war. Openly accusing Isabella of patricide would have risked everything. The Queen Dowager wasn't just his mother, she was a symbol of legitimacy, the link between his reign and the Capetian bloodline of France. Exposing her as a regicide could have destabilized his throne, inviting rivals to question whether a son born of treason could rule with divine right. And then there's the personal cost. Charging Isabella would have meant sending her to the scaffold alongside Mortimer, a step even the hardest medieval monarchs shrank from. Family bonds were political currency, and parricide stained a dynasty for generations. But there's another layer: evidence, or the lack of it. Edward III may have suspected the truth, but proving it was another matter. The killers, if they existed, had covered their tracks meticulously. No eyewitnesses came forward, no deathbed confessions surfaced, and Berkeley Castle's records were conspicuously sparse. Without concrete proof, accusing his own mother risked backfiring, painting him as a son willing to slander his family for political gain. Yet the most tantalizing possibility is that Edward's silence wasn't ignorance or weakness, it was strategy. By executing Mortimer on generic treason charges while sparing Isabella, he sent a carefully coded message. The nobility would have understood the subtext. Mortimer took the fall for crimes too dangerous to name, while the Queen's involvement was deliberately left ambiguous. This way, Edward could punish the guilty without dragging the monarchy through the mud. Even the timing of his actions hints at calculation. He waited until he'd secured his marriage to Philippa of Hainault, a union that bolstered his independence from Isabella's influence, before making his move. The real clue lies in what Edward did next. Though he never spoke of his father's murder, he enshrined Edward II's memory in ways that spoke volumes. He transformed Gloucester Abbey into a pilgrimage site, commissioning an alabaster effigy so lifelike it seemed to breathe. He allowed miracles to be attributed to his father's tomb, elevating him to near sainthood. These weren't the acts of a son who believed in the official story of natural death. They were the gestures of a king crafting a martyr's legacy without ever saying the words. In the end, Edward III's silence may have been the ultimate power play. By leaving the truth unspoken, he kept his hands clean while letting history draw its own conclusions. Because sometimes in the Game of Thrones, what isn't said screams louder than any accusation. Modern forensic science has turned its gaze backward, applying today's medical knowledge to one of history's oldest cold cases. Could contemporary techniques finally settle the debate over Edward II's death? Some researchers argue yes, by dissecting the sparse historical clues through the lens of medieval anatomy and pathology. Take the infamous red-hot poker theory. While gruesome, it's not medically implausible. Burns severe enough to cause fatal internal trauma might leave minimal external marks, especially if concentrated in areas like the rectum, a method suggested by Geoffrey Le Baker's Chronicle. Modern pathology confirms that intense localized heat could induce shock, organ failure, or fatal infections without obvious surface wounds. The heavy makeup at Edward's funeral. It aligns eerily with attempts to conceal subtle discoloration or swelling from thermal injuries, but skeptics point to a glaring hole: no surviving physical evidence. Without Edward's remains, forensic analysis relies on interpreting medieval texts with all their biases. Some scholars have reconstructed the conditions of Berkeley Castle's dungeon to test alternative theories. One experiment simulated suffocation using period-accurate materials. A mattress, for instance, could indeed cause death without visible trauma, especially if combined with restraints. Others have analyzed medieval accounts of lethal punishment, noting that professional assassins of the era favored methods like strangulation with silk cords, leaving faint ligature marks easily hidden by a high-collared shroud. The most compelling modern insight, though, comes from psychology. Historians now recognize how trauma manifests in contemporary accounts. The lurid details in later chronicles, Edward's screams, the alleged poker's shape, may reflect societal anxieties about power and cruelty rather than factual reporting. Forensic linguists have even dissected the Fieschi Letter's phrasing, comparing it to Edward's verified writings. The verdict, some turns of phrase, matches style, but the letter's survival narrative fits a pattern of medieval escape myths where fallen leaders live on in folklore. Yet for all our tools, the core challenge remains: medieval deaths weren't documented like modern crime scenes. What we call evidence is often propaganda, rumor, or poetic license. A fracture on a recovered skull might prove murder, but Edward's tomb has never been conclusively examined. Until then, science can only highlight possibilities, not verdicts. The real lesson: some mysteries resist even 21st century scrutiny, not from lack of effort, but because history sometimes leaves us with shadows instead of answers. Perhaps the most telling gap is in the forensics of power. Modern analysts can reconstruct how Edward might have died, but not why his killers chose or fabricated a specific method. The brutality of the poker, if real, wasn't just murder, it was symbolic annihilation designed to unmake a king's dignity, and that's something no autopsy report can quantify. Science can explain the mechanics of death, but the whispers of history, those still belong to the ghosts. Berkeley Castle hides more secrets than its stone walls let on. Over the centuries, archaeologists and historians have combed its corridors, searching for traces of Edward II's final days, or proof of an audacious escape. The castle's structure itself tells a story. Recent surveys reveal a network of hidden passages, some leading from the inner chambers down to the riverbank. These weren't just architectural quirks, they were lifelines for prisoners or guards who needed to move unseen. One tunnel, now bricked up, aligns with medieval accounts of a secret way used during Edward's imprisonment. Could this have been his route to freedom? Then there's the infamous King's Gallery, the room where Edward allegedly met his brutal end. Forensic investigations of the floor and walls have turned up no definitive bloodstains or scorch marks, but that doesn't rule out foul play. Medieval stonework has been scrubbed, replaced, or worn down over 7 centuries. More telling is the discovery of a concealed alcove behind what would have been Edward's cell, large enough to hide assailants or stash a body. If the murder did happen here, it was staged with chilling precision. But the most tantalizing find, a 14th century ledger uncovered in the castle's archives, listing payments for masons and carpenters during Edward's imprisonment. The entries are vague, but the timing is suspicious. Why renovate a dungeon unless you're covering something up? Some researchers argue these could be receipts for sealing escape routes after the fact. Others point to a cryptic note about repairs to the iron gate by the water, fueling speculation that Edward's jailers were reinforcing weak points he might have exploited. The castle's layout adds another layer to the puzzle. Berkeley's design was typical of Norman fortresses, meant to keep people in as much as out. Yet its proximity to the River Severn, a bustling trade route, raises questions. If Edward did slip away, blending into the flow of merchants and pilgrims wouldn't have been impossible. Archaeology can't settle the debate, but it deepens the mystery. Every stone, every hidden passage whispers a different possibility. Whether Edward died in these walls or vanished through them, Berkeley Castle remains a silent witness to one of history's most elusive truths. Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II didn't just dramatize history, it weaponized it. Written in 1592, at the height of Elizabethan England's political and religious turmoil, Marlowe transformed Edward's downfall into a searing critique of power, sexuality, and tyranny. The play revels in its subversion. Edward's relationship with Piers Gaveston isn't just hinted at, its center stage, dripping with longing and defiance. And the murder scene, Marlowe leans into the red-hot poker myth with graphic, almost gleeful brutality, staging it as a grotesque act of vengeance by Mortimer and Isabella. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. In an era when playwrights skirted censorship with allegory, Marlowe's unflinching portrayal made Edward a symbol of doomed excess, a warning to rulers who put personal passions above duty. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Edward's story takes a Gothic turn. Victorian novelists like Emily Bronte and Bram Stoker had a field day with the Berkeley Castle rumors, weaving tales of spectral kings and hidden torture chambers. Edward became less a historical figure and more a Gothic archetype, the tormented nobleman, his screams echoing through time. These portrayals cemented the poker story in popular imagination, turning medieval gossip into literary fact. Even historians of the era, like Agnes Strickland, recycled Marlowe's theatrics as biography, blurring the line between drama and documented history. Hollywood, unsurprisingly, couldn't resist the scandal. The 1924 silent film The Loves of Queen Isabella framed Edward's death as a grand melodrama, with Isabella as a tragic heroine driven to murder by her husband's cruelty. By the time Derek Jarman adapted Marlowe's play in 1991, the focus had shifted. Edward's sexuality became a lens for modern debates about oppression and resistance. Jarman's avant-garde staging, complete with anachronistic punk aesthetics, wasn't just entertainment. It was provocation, forcing audiences to confront the parallels between medieval persecution and 20th century queer struggles. Yet for all the adaptations, one thread remains constant. Each era molds Edward's story to reflect its own anxieties. Marlowe's Elizabethan audience saw a cautionary tale of weak leadership. The Victorians saw Gothic horror. Modern retellings grapple with identity and power. The real Edward, flawed, complex, and endlessly debated, gets buried under layers of interpretation. But perhaps that's the point. History isn't just what happened, it's what we need to believe happened. And Edward's murder, whether fact or fabrication, endures because it lets us project our darkest fascinations onto the past. Edward II's fate wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a brutal pattern woven into the fabric of medieval power. Take the infamous case of the princes in the Tower, those two young boys who vanished in 1483 under the watch of their uncle, Richard III. Like Edward, they were obstacles to someone's ambition, locked away in a fortress before disappearing into the shadows of history. The parallels are chilling: rushed burials, manufactured narratives, and a trail of documents that suspiciously dry up when they're needed most. Both cases show how medieval rulers treated inconvenient relatives not as family, but as problems to be erased. But the similarities run deeper than just method. Look at how their killers manipulated perception. Richard III's propagandists spread rumors the princes were illegitimate, just as Edward's enemies painted him as a weak, sinful king. In both cases, character assassination paved the way for physical elimination, and the aftermath, carefully staged displays of grief. Richard donated to churches where the boys were supposedly buried, while Isabella and Mortimer ensured Edward's corpse was paraded as proof of a natural death. Theatre was as crucial as the act itself. Then there's the case of Richard II, deposed and starved to death in Pontefract Castle in 1400. His crime, unlike Edward, Richard wasn't incompetent. He was too competent, alienating nobles with his centralization of power. Yet his end followed the same playbook: imprisonment in a remote stronghold, a hushed-up death, and a hastily arranged funeral to quell unrest. Medieval history is littered with these scripted tragedies, each one a reminder that the difference between a throne and a dungeon was often just a few whispered orders. What unites them all is the calculus of survival. In a world where bloodlines were power, living claimants were liabilities. Whether it was Edward's potential restoration, the prince's superior claim, or Richard II's lingering popularity, the solution was grimly consistent. And the killers, they rarely faced justice. Like Mortimer, Richard III fell to his enemies, but the truth died with him. The real lesson of these murders isn't just about cruelty, it's about how power thrives in silence. Because in the Middle Ages, the safest secrets weren't just buried, they were rewritten into legend. In the tangled web of Edward II's downfall, one thread stands out starkly: the silence of the church. At a time when bishops held sway over kings and excommunication could topple empires, the absence of moral outrage over Edward's murder speaks volumes. On paper, regicide was the ultimate sin in medieval theology, a violation of divine order that condemned both the killer and the kingdom. Yet when Edward's life was snuffed out, Rome didn't thunder with denunciations. No papal bulls condemned his killers, no local bishops refused Isabella and Mortimer communion. Instead, the Church's reaction hovered somewhere between tacit approval and strategic indifference. To understand why, we need to unpack the medieval Church's double game. On one hand, clergy preached the sacredness of royal blood, citing scripture like Romans 13, which commanded obedience to earthly rulers as God's appointed. But theology had loopholes. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas had carved out exceptions, arguing a tyrant defined broadly as any ruler who harmed his people could be justly removed. Edward's disastrous reign, with its military failures and favoritism, made him an easy target for that label. Chroniclers loyal to Mortimer took pains to frame Edward's deposition as a moral necessity, painting him as a ruler who'd abandoned his divine duty. It was a narrative the Church hierarchy, weary of Edward's mismanagement and eager for stability, found convenient to accept. The Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Walter Reynolds, embodied this contradiction. Once Edward's close ally, he'd grown disillusioned as the king's reign crumbled. When Isabella and Mortimer staged their coup, Reynolds didn't just stay neutral, he actively blessed the transfer of power to young Edward III. His sermons framed the transition as God's will, a subtle endorsement that lent spiritual cover to what was essentially a coup. Worse, when rumors of murder began circulating, Reynolds made no move to investigate or condemn. His inaction sent a clear message: the Church wouldn't defend a fallen king. But the real tell lies in Edward's posthumous treatment. Despite dying under clouds of suspicion, he was buried with full royal honors at Gloucester Abbey, a site chosen not for its political significance but for its Benedictine monks known for their discretion. The funeral liturgy, usually a platform to extol a king's virtues, was curiously muted. No fiery homilies denounced his killers, no calls for justice echoed in the vaulted ceilings. Instead, the ceremony focused narrowly on Edward's supposed piety, a safe theme that avoided awkward questions. Even the tomb itself, later adorned with pilgrims' offerings, became a quiet rebuke to the official narrative. The people venerated Edward as a martyr, while the Church's hierarchy looked the other way. This duality reveals the uncomfortable truth about medieval power: theology bent to politics when necessary. The same Church that preached against regicide could turn a blind eye if the victim was sufficiently discredited. Edward's fate wasn't just a lesson in royal vulnerability. It exposed how easily divine authority could be weaponized by those holding the pen. When the chronicles were written and the sermons delivered, the winners didn't just rewrite history, they sanctified it. Edward II's murder has never been just a historical event. It's a mirror reflecting how each generation interprets power, violence, and truth. Victorian historians, steeped in romanticism and moralizing, framed his death as a tragic melodrama. To scholars like William Stubbs, Edward was a weak king who reaped what he sowed, his gruesome end serving as divine retribution for his flawed reign. The red-hot poker story, with its Gothic horror, fit perfectly into their narratives of moral failing and poetic justice. These historians often portrayed Isabella as a wronged woman pushed to extremes, her actions justified by Edward's misrule and personal betrayals. The Victorians weren't just recording history, they were crafting morality tales where vice met violent virtue. By the mid-20th century, the pendulum swung toward skepticism. Historians like May McKissack and T.F. Tout began dissecting the chronicles with forensic precision, exposing contradictions and biases. They noted how later accounts, like Geoffrey Le Baker's, were riddled with political agendas. The poker story, once accepted as fact, was reassessed as propaganda, a grisly myth to vilify Mortimer and Isabella. these scholars shifted focus to the structural weaknesses of Edward's reign, arguing his downfall was inevitable, murder or not. Their work peeled back layers of legend, revealing a king whose real crime wasn't immorality but incompetence. Modern historians go even further. Ian Mortimer's controversial biography, The Greatest Traitor, reignited debate by championing the Fieschi Letter's survival theory. He argues Edward's escape wasn't just possible, it was likely, given the gaps in official records. Meanwhile, Seymour Phillips' exhaustive research reaffirms the traditional murder narrative but strips away the sensationalism, attributing Edward's death to cold political calculus rather than personal vendettas. Today's academics also explore the cultural dimensions, how Edward's rumored homosexuality shaped his posthumous reputation, or how his story reflects medieval anxieties about masculinity and power. What unites these evolving perspectives is their preoccupation with ambiguity. Where Victorians saw moral clarity, modern scholars see a Rorschach test of competing truths. Edward's murder isn't just a medieval cold case, it's a battleground for how we understand the past. And as long as Berkeley Castle stones keep their secrets, historians will keep rewriting the story. Because some mysteries don't just endure, they evolve. Centuries after his death, Edward II's fate still grips us because it isn't just a medieval whodunit. It's a dark reflection of the timeless forces that shape history. Power, betrayal, and the slippery nature of truth aren't confined to the 14th century. They're universal currents that still churn beneath our modern world. Think about it. How many times have we seen leaders toppled, reputations destroyed, or facts rewritten by those who control the narrative? Edward's story resonates because it strips bare the mechanics of power, revealing how easily reality can be bent when the stakes are high enough. Consider the parallels to today's political dramas. The smears against Edward, rumors of incompetence, whispers about his relationships, the orchestrated campaign to paint him as unfit, feel eerily familiar. Modern propaganda may not be scribbled by monks on vellum, but the playbook hasn't changed. Spin a compelling story, silence dissent, and let time blur the line between fact and fiction. Edward's murder, whether by poker, suffocation, or staged escape, endures because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How much of what we accept as history is just the version that survived the victor's editing? Then there's the raw human drama, betrayal by family, the collapse of loyalty, the desperation of a fallen king. These aren't medieval tropes. They're the stuff of Shakespearean tragedy, true crime podcasts, and prestige TV. Isabella's transformation from pawn to puppeteer, Mortimer's fatal overreach, Edward's son wrestling with his father's legacy, these arcs pulse with the kind of moral complexity that hooks us in Game of Thrones or Succession. We're drawn to stories where power corrupts, where love curdles into vengeance because they hold up a mirror to our own flaws and fears. But perhaps the deepest reason this mystery lingers is the gnawing absence of certainty. Most historical puzzles eventually yield to evidence, but Edward's death dances just out of reach. The Fieschi Letter, the forensic ambiguities, the eerie gaps in the record, they tease us with the possibility that history got it wrong. In an age of deepfakes and misinformation, that uncertainty feels unsettlingly relevant. If we can't even trust the fate of a king documented in centuries-old chronicles, how solid are the truths we take for granted today? Edward's story endures because it's more than a corpse in a castle. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth, the price of power, and the whispers that outlast empires. And in those shadows where history and myth blur, we keep listening because the past never stops speaking. Centuries of debate have left us with more questions than answers about Edward II's fate, but let's weigh the scales. On one side, the case for murder is staggering. The timing alone reeks of conspiracy. Edward dies mere months after a failed rescue plot, just as Isabella and Mortimer's grip on power grows precarious. The suspicious lack of medical details, the rushed funeral, the heavy makeup on his corpse, these aren't just red flags, they're a tapestry of cover-ups. Even the chroniclers of the time, usually eager to record royal ailments, suddenly go mute. And then there's the damning backdrop. Deposed medieval kings didn't retire peacefully. From Richard II to the princes in the Tower, elimination was the norm, not the exception. Yet the counter-arguments hold unsettling weight. No eyewitnesses ever came forward. No deathbed confessions surfaced, even when Mortimer faced execution. The infamous red-hot poker tale emerges decades later, dripping with political bias, likely propaganda to blacken Mortimer's name. Even Edward's own son, who had every reason to expose the crime, never formally accused his mother or her lover. And what of the Fieschi Letter? Its survival theory, while audacious, isn't impossible. Kings had escaped captivity before. The letter's intimate details, like Edward recalling his son's childhood promise about a hunting dog, are hauntingly specific for a forgery. The real enigma lies in the gaps. Why were Berkeley Castle's records from that spring mysteriously scrubbed? Why did Isabella, after years of lavish spending, suddenly fund prayers for Edward's soul? These aren't just loose threads, they're frayed edges of a truth we'll never fully grasp. Medieval power didn't just rewrite history, it burned the originals. So here's the chilling question that lingers: will we ever know? Science could exhume Edward's remains, but even DNA might not decode a death masked by 7 centuries of lies. Perhaps the real mystery isn't how Edward died, but why we're so desperate to solve it. Because his story forces us to confront the darkest truth of all. History isn't written in facts, but in the silence between them. What's your theory? Drop it in the comments. Let's keep the hunt alive.